Okay, we'll get started now. I'm Dr. Richard Boles. The first thing that I want to mention is that the neurodevelopmental disorders, such as autism and ADHD, and there are many others, they overlap each other to a great amount. And that patients that have one of them often, but not always, will have more than one. And that's because they involve different processes of the brain, and you can have several of them at the same time. And I'm going to show the slide again, but just so that it makes a little sense now when I talk about autism or ADHD or anxiety or many of these other conditions, that they're really all related. Um, First patient I'll talk about is Pam, and he has autistic disorder diagnosed at 18 months. He had vomiting a few months before that. He has some mental health issues, OCD being another one of the neurodevelopmental disorders, and anxiety. And he had some functional problems such as fatigue, constipation, insomnia. Sequencing all of his DNA, or actually the majority of the genes involved in mitochondrial dysfunction in Pam, revealed a variant in the creatine transporter. The creatine transporter is required to transport creatine from blood to brain, and creatine is like a battery. It stores energy. You can store energy in the muscles or in the brain for later use. Um, Creatine is sometimes used in people that have creatine transport disorders. If you give a large amount of it, enough of it will get across. But more commonly, what happens is that the creatine transporter is not working right, so it just simply can't get into the brain. So the father used cyclocreatine, which is similar to creatine, but it crosses the blood-brain barrier. And you can see that the changes that he had, less anxiety, more expressive language, less behavioral manifestations, better able to handle change and frustrations, more visual attention, etc. And this is an example of a secondary mitochondrial dysfunction, because the creatine transporter is not in the mitochondria, it's on the cell membrane. But nonetheless, it does cause mitochondrial dysfunction because creatine is part of the energy metabolism. The next one is Carter, presented when he lost speech at 1 year of age, later diagnosed with autism. Biochemical laboratory testing suggested the possibility of a mitochondrial disorder. We found a common mutation, 253 valine in the TRAP1 gene. Computer modeling predicted that ganastatron, which is known by the trade name in the United States of Caitril, would bind to the mutant TRAP1 protein, the abnormal TRAP1 molecule with the mutation in it, but not the normal TRAP1. And the idea is to turn off the mutant, but not the normal TRAP1. So he was given Caitril, and you can see that the change is here. Before he was given the medication, he would like run around, make animal noises. There's no way they could ever go to a restaurant. But once on Caitril, he was able to sit and eat, and he was a good boy. Several times he was taken off of Caitril, mostly because pharmacies ran out of the drug. There was a nationwide and a worldwide shortage, and also insurance issues. And every single time that he went off of it, he deteriorated. And the asterisks are the ones that specifically he becomes less focused, more aggressive, and he has sensory integration issues when he goes off the drug, and then they return when he goes back. And it gets back to his previous improved baseline when he goes on. So while he made the criteria for autism, he, for many years, has not met autistic criteria, but he very much has ADHD. He's inattentive, impulsive, and hyperactive. He always was those things. In fact, those were a major part of what was going on. But he had so much developmental delay and autism that the ADHD aspects were not really noted. And he is improved on the typical methylphenidate, which is many of the ADHD drugs are brand names of that. When he is on Caitril, he's much better in terms of that. Off Caitril, he also had more attention deficit disorder. It's actually quite common among my patients with a diagnosis of autism for when we find the molecular abnormality and treat it, that they then meet criteria for ADHD. Sort of, you can think of it as a milder form of autism, but it's actually ADHD is involved in a different part of the brain. And it's very often that people with autism will have siblings or other family members with ADHD. So they are definitely genetically and phenotypically related. And this just to show you that with advanced technology, in this case sequencing all 3 billion nucleotides of the genome, it can seem like magic in that you can take somebody who has mental or neurodevelopmental issues, find out what the problem is, and if you find something that's treatable, make a huge difference. Of course, this also shows that I'm a science fiction geek, and this is my daughter. She's a bit bigger now, and that was about 12 years ago. So who am I? I wear many different hats. I'm different people on different days. I'm dad to 4 children or young adults. But in terms of what I'm saying here to now and professionally, I think of myself as a physician more than anything else. I was at Children's Hospital Los Angeles for 20 years. I am presently the director of the Neurabilities Neurogenomics program, which uses sequencing technology to understand why people have neurological disease and to improve the treatment that is provided by the doctors there. I am also the chief medical and scientific officer and one of the founders of NeuroNeeds, and on that role, I'm speaking to you today. That's the company that produces many of the products that I'm going to be talking about at the end. In general, I make the products that I thought would benefit my patients, and I find that they do benefit my patients. I learned how to work in the DNA sequencing world by working for different companies. I was at Cortigen for 5 years, for 6 months at Lineagen, and as a consultant in 2 other companies. Right now, I don't work for any of the companies. I'm a free agent. I order from many of the companies, and I'm not paid. My role is that of the ordering physician for my patients. I've also been an expert witness in many legal cases, particularly involved in medical child abuse cases. And then I'm still writing papers on the cause of disorders such as autism, ADHD, cyclic vomiting, and others. And when I was at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, I was also faculty at the University of Southern California, or USC, for 20 years, and I had a research lab. So a few more disclosures. Personalized medicine, that's where we find what's wrong in an individual patient and figure out how to treat it. Obviously, there's no studies that will be related to that individual patient. The idea is to try to figure out how to treat that patient versus what studies have done in thousands or millions of patients and then using that information. So when we find something to treat an individual patient, it's usually off-label. Off-label means that the FDA does not approve it for that use. In fact, in pediatrics, a very large number of the drugs that are generally used are off-label because no one studied them in children. I'm also involved financially and logistically with the NeuroNeeds company that markets some of the products that we're going to be talking about. And regarding genetic sequencing in ADHD, autism, other disorders, there have been guidelines that have been put like a decade ago, which are completely and utterly useless now. There really are no official guidelines. And what you're going to hear about are my own recommendations. All right, first of all, so ADHD, what is that? Inattention is one of the major aspects of that. And you can see the part in green there are, what is the problem with that? I have, one of my 4 children has severe ADHD, so I also live this as the father of a teenager with that disorder, in addition to all my other roles. And many of you will say, yeah, he's got, or, she has a lot of those. Some of them will be talking about yourself, many of them will be talking about your children. If you really have only the inattentive aspects of it, then you have inattentive ADHD, and of course it needs to be present for at least 6 months. So there's one thing in particular here is that, just a minute, let me go to the next few slides. The other part is hyperactivity and impulsivity. In little kids, hyperactivity is pretty obvious and impulsivity. In older individuals, older children, teenagers, and adults, impulsivity could be verbal, in that you say things or maybe text people before you really think about what you mean, and not necessarily violent. And hyperactivity can be fidgeting, always on the go, not wanting to stay in a chair very long, moving around, looking around a lot. So hyperactivity is specific to the age situation. If you have the inattentiveness and the hyperactivity impulsivity, then you have it combined. So then you have the ADHD instead of just ADD. And then there's more caveats. You want to make sure that this happens in more than one setting. So not just at school or at work or social or at home, but in different settings, so that it's a biological issue and not an interpersonal issue or with one particular situation. We're also talking about symptoms that occur before age 12 years. So though in adult ADHD, sometimes you have to go back and say, yeah, they were there before, but they've become more manifest now. Now, ADHD is really common on 5 to 7% of children and adolescents, and about 2.5 to 5% of adults worldwide. So that means that the low estimates are 4 million children and 6 million adults in the United States. Now, I showed you this slide before. There's a few little things on top of it. One thing I want to show you is that with ADHD, mood disorders like anxiety and depression are really common, 30% each. 50% will have at least one of those two. It overlaps with many other conditions. Other neurodevelopmental conditions that have a high overlap would be are shown there. Autism, intellectual disability, also known as mental retardation or developmental delay. Learning disorders, many different types of them, including sensory integration disorders, auditory or visual disorders, dyslexia, etc. Conduct disorder often is an overlap, and then there's the mood disorders I've already mentioned, depression and anxiety, but it also overlaps to a lesser degree other issues such as psychosis, migraine, and seizure disorders. In fact, that the genes that build the brain, when something goes wrong with, can cause any number of these disorders and many others. But the difference between ADHD and the others is really executive function. Executive function includes working memory, cognitive flexibility, that you can change from one idea or from one task to another, and inhibitory control. So what's inhibitory control is like the little angel sitting on your shoulder saying, no, maybe we ought to think before we text that, or maybe we ought to do our work now, or maybe we ought to stop eating, or something like that. So that's really the executive function, to be able to handle the rest of the brain, including the emotional parts of the brain, and say, we should probably do this instead. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch from one thing to another, such as transitions or different ways of thinking. And then, of course, you know what working memory is what you can keep in your mind at one moment. It's not long-term memory, but what you have at one moment. People with ADHD, they tend to get overwhelmed very easily as their working memory fills up, and then they can't add anything else to it at that point, so they get very frustrated. So here's a fun way to look at it, and while it's mostly fun and games, there's actually a lot of truth to these things. The Winnie the Pooh characters all kind of have a lot of psychopathology, and then there's some of the more obvious ones. Some of the things like Tigger with ADHD and Rabbit with OCD are really obvious. Piglet with anxiety, Eeyore with depression. Obviously schizophrenia, and that Christopher Robin is imagining all of this. But you can have different aspects of these. Everybody has some anxiety. In fact, having no anxiety would be very bad. Everyone's got some OCD, some depression, some, loss of reality, some ADHD. And the question is what percent? And when it goes over a certain percent, it can become detrimental. And if it becomes detrimental to the way that person wants to live their life or to the ability to maintain relationships with other people, you can say that it's disease or pathology. So everyone's got somewhere between 1 and 100% of all of these. If you're wondering what these percentages are, I took the test, and this is me. So I'm sort of a rabbit roo. But fortunately, I'm not too high in anything. But and most people that take this test that have one or more of these diagnoses will find that it's really not they have one thing, but they have a little bit of a lot of things. And maybe the one thing they thought they had is a little bit more than the others, or maybe it's another. So the idea here is that, these are normal traits, and it's just when the trait gets to a certain point that it causes disruption in your life that it causes disease. Now, ADHD, I mean, you can think about, Tigger and how fun it is to watch that, but ADHD can really be serious, and I think most of you probably already know that. It can cause things that you might not think about. People with ADHD have more lung cancer because they smoke more. They have children at a younger age. I think it's obvious as to what part of the guardian angel didn't work there. They have more difficulty in school and in maintaining jobs. They have more accidents, more automobile accidents, more pedestrian accidents. I mean, you can go on, but it affects life itself and the enjoyment of life in so many different areas. More obesity, more cholesterol because they can't watch their diet as well. The guardian angel that says maybe I ought to eat the broccoli instead, not functioning very well. So that's why when I talk about ADHD, while everybody has some, people that have a significant amount, this is a disease which affects a lot of different things, and it really should be taken seriously. Meaning that diagnosis and treatment, to do this as you would any disease, you wouldn't play around with diabetes, or you would get appropriate treatment. ADHD is the same thing. The other thing about ADHD is it's very highly hereditary. Genetics is the vast majority of the cause of ADHD. These are all different studies, and a lot of them have been done. They all show 60% or more inheritability. 60% inheritability is 40% everything else, meaning the environment, including random factors. So some of these are almost 100%, and most of the modern studies are up about 80%. This is extremely high. If you look at things like cancer and heart disease, and you're talking about inheritabilities of 30, 40%. These are much higher. In fact, ADHD and autism are considered to be the most inherited common disorders of any disorder whatsoever. So if you have ADHD, siblings are at a 9-fold increased risk for ADHD. Interestingly, adopted relatives have no increased risk. So while there is an environmental component to ADHD, the environmental component is not transmissible in a family. So if somebody has ADHD or doesn't have ADHD, if you adopt them into a family that does or that doesn't, the adopted family has really no influence on whether they'll have ADHD or not. In other words, the risk factors that are environmental are probably prenatal. So the conclusion is that, well, first of all, ADHD is an extreme of a trait that varies in the populations. I showed you with the POO scales that everyone's got some degree of inattentiveness. But when you have ADHD, it's the extreme end. And the people at the extreme end, it's highly genetic as to who is there. This is really complicated, but I want to show you what the latest in science is regarding that. A GWAS, a genome-wide association study, looked at all of the genes, all 20,000 or so genes, in 20,000 people with ADHD, 35,000 people without it, and found that these are the genes that most predict ADHD. And on the right-hand side, I picked a few of the major ones, and I showed you what they're involved with. Synapses. are the major issue here. Communication processes, how the neurons communicate with each other. Dopamine levels in the synapse, wiring of the synapse, forming the synapse. So it's, as you'd expect, connecting the neurons together, the genes that are involved in that are often the genes involved in ADHD. The thing is that all of the genes that have been picked up on a GWAS study only account for about 10% of ADHD. That means 90% of why you have ADHD are not those genes. If you look at all common variants and the hundreds of genes that are associated, you only add another 10%. That means that 2/3 of the genetic factors are due to rare variants, variants that are seen in a few families or maybe nobody else. So since about 80% or so of ADHD is genetic and 2/3 of it are due to rare variants, we're talking that the majority of the cause of ADHD are rare variants, not variants that you can find in textbooks that affect many individuals, but ones that only affect that family. If you look at large rare variants, ones that affect hundreds, thousands, or even millions of DNA base pairs, they are definitely increasing ADHD. And I showed you on this slide some of the pathways involved. Note that respiratory chain, that's mitochondria, carbohydrate derivative catabolic process, and organonitrogen compounds, these are all metabolic or mitochondrial metabolic issues. And then the ion gated are channels. So two of the major areas involved are energy metabolism / metabolic disorders and ion channels. Those are, and we're going to be talking about those throughout this. In fact, the 2 patients that I told you about so far, both of those involved mitochondrial energy metabolism. The other thing is that the genes that are involved in ADHD are also genes involved in autism and schizophrenia and bipolar disease and depression. I can go on, including migraine and many other conditions, because these are genes that are important to build and maintain a brain. And if something goes wrong, the brain's not functioning quite right, everybody has mistakes in their DNA. In fact, everyone has a lot of mistakes in their DNA. But when you have too many of them in certain pathways, then disease can occur. What disease will occur depends on all of the variants and the environment together. This is the machine that can do it. To give you an idea of the size, if you divide it into 2, look at the right-hand side. It looks sort of like a refrigerator. It's the size of a refrigerator to show you really how big this is. This machine is the HiSeq 4000, can sequence all of a person's DNA in about 3 hours. The first person's DNA in the Human Genome Project took laboratories throughout the world billions of dollars in about a decade. This machine can now sequence the entire genetic code in a person in 3 hours. So you can load it up over the weekend and sequence a whole bunch of people. And that's why we have the ability now to do whole genome sequencing and get the information that we have. By the way, this machine cost $1 million. Just really quick, most of these have autism. Some of them they're all neurodevelopmental disorders. 2 years ago, I just looked at the last 7 patients that I looked at, and I found mutations that are highly likely to be the cause of disease in all 7. I don't always have a 100% success rate. It's usually around 50% to find the cause of the disease. But they were on all different pathways. And the interventions are all different. You can see on the right-hand side, each and every one of these cases, I found something to intervene on. And about half of them got significantly better, which is, again, I'm batting about 50% in terms of how many patients I can significantly improve based upon what we find on genetics. So to put this together, I built the peer-to-peer counseling service, and it's been operating for about 2 years now. And the idea here is that the genetics is really complicated, and there's extremely few physicians that really understand how to read the whole genetic code and how to take that and translate it into outcomes. On the other hand, I mean, I've run laboratories before, and it's almost impossible to really know the patient and really figure out what's going on. It's very common that what happens is I'll look at a genetic code and I'll see a bunch of stuff and I say, I don't know. Feel really good about this. I don't think I figured out what's going on. And then I talk to the patient and go over the sequences, and then we said, yeah, this one is a really perfect fit. So really, from the laboratory standpoint, you can only do so much because you don't really know that much about the patient, and you can't take that information directly back to the patient. But as the physician of the patient, you know far more, and you can go back and ask questions, and you can work it out. It says, okay, this one doesn't seem to fit, but this one looks like it does. So, but how can you do that? I mean, does that mean that your physician has to be a geneticist that has worked for companies like this? Well, that's not practical for everybody. So the peer-to-peer service is to try to connect it together so that the physician on the phone can talk to me, and we can go over the sequence, we can go over the patient, and we can discuss together what's going on. And in many situations, the family can be on the phone at the same time. It depends on medical licensure. If I can do a telemedicine in that state, then the family can be involved. If not, then it's not legal to do that. So in the United States, the parents or the patient, if the patient's affected, can be on the phone at the same time, so we can ask some questions so they can hear the conversation. Right now with the COVID rules, because the government doesn't want anyone traveling for medical care, I can do telemedicine in all 50 states. How long that will last, who knows? If you're interested in the service, here's the person here, neurogenomics at neuroabilities.com. And then there's also the website if you want to know more information. And I also do direct telemedicine, not involving another physician, which I'm the physician. Okay, so how does this work? 72% of the patients that we've done so far have neurodevelopmental disorders, ADHD and autism being the major ones. 55% got an exact molecular diagnosis. This is what the cause is. 95% I recommended a treatment. We haven't put all the data together in terms of how many actually improved. It's around 50-50 or so. Okay, so treatment overviews. So neurodevelopmental disorders, again, autism, ADHD. How to put all this together? First of all, you have to address the factors that are important in all people. Diet, exercise, sleep, avoid toxic substances. That just sounds like just general, healthy living and good health. Well, the mitochondria is very important in all cells because all cells need energy to do everything they do, essentially. And if the mitochondria is not working right, the cells are likely to be dysfunctional and you could have a disease. And these things are really important for mitochondrial health. So in many ways, mitochondrial health is general health. So also in addition to just general health, and those things are important. If you're not sleeping, it's going to be really hard to get control of the ADHD. We need to address those areas which are really common, and mitochondrial dysfunctions on the top there, but also neurotransmission, ion channels, inflammation or autoimmunity, and many others, including the gut microbiome. And those are not all of the pathways, but those are some of the main pathways. And also, those are treatable pathways. And then, of course, we need to address factors that are specific to the individual genetic defect in each individual. That requires sequencing the whole genome, in many cases, to find the cause. Trio, meaning the parents as well, because a lot of these are de novo mutations, new mutations not found in the parents. And really the only way to know that for sure is to sequence the parents at the same time. Once we find these abnormalities, they're often something that is only a few in the world or no one's ever reported before. Then it requires out-of-the-box approaches to say, okay, here's what the problem is. How can we do something about that? How can we make that better? So here again are some of the major pathways that are involved in the neurodevelopmental disorders. And these are the general modalities that can be helpful. You can see that supplements, all of them, supplements are often useful for. Diet, very common among them, and medications, yeah, some of them medications as well. I tend to use supplements, diet, and medications as my major modalities, but occasionally things don't fit into that, like exercise. Um, and they can affect many different pathways. Okay, so treatment overview. I showed this slide before. I'm going to start with mitochondrial dysfunction because that really is probably the main pathway involved, at least the main treatable pathway. I looked at the United Mitochondrial Disease website, and while the formatting is mine, I took off all the things I could find on their website in relationship to the type of symptoms that you would see. The green are all neurological or neuromuscular related, nerve or muscle. You can see that the vast majority of the problems are nerve and muscle because their nerves are electrical. They require a lot of energy, and muscles obviously require a lot of energy as well. So while mitochondria are needed for all cells to do everything, preferentially mitochondrial dysfunction affects the nerves and muscle, and including neurodevelopmental disorders. So neuromuscular is the most common because it's the highest energy requirements. Adults with diagnosable mitochondrial disease, 60% at least of them have a mental health disorder because the parts of the brain that are involved in mental health require a lot of energy. And here's some of the more common problems that you see, depression and anxiety being the major ones. And antioxidants are the primary therapy for mitochondrial disease. But antioxidants are also being used for a wide variety of brain disorders, everything from Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, Huntington's, autism, schizophrenia, depression, addiction, substance abuse, OCD. I can go on and on with that. But antioxidants are really considered to be primary therapy in a large number of disorders that involve the brain. So what about ADHD? Well, ADHD is closely related genetically to many of these other ones that are known to be caused by mitochondrial dysfunction. And are mitochondria abnormal in ADHD? And if so, what are the treatment options? Well, here are a number of papers that show that there are mitochondrial abnormalities in ADHD. So there's actually quite a bit of work. The two on the top that show in green, the titles, those are, I think are the best ones to take a look at. But there are a lot of papers, and these are the only ones I can fit on a slide, that involve ADHD and oxidative stress or mitochondrial dysfunction. So there really is a good connection there. Unfortunately, many of the medications which are used to treat ADHD also cause oxidative stress. And here are some of the references involved. So that's just not me saying it, but a lot of people have been looking at that. I know that medication use in ADHD is very controversial. And personally, as a physician and as a parent, ADHD is a serious disorder. And while I start with natural nutritional substances, more often than not, we're going to medications because otherwise we're going to be dealing with social and school failure. And while there are oxidative stress involved with the major drugs used in ADHD, they have their uses and their necessities in many cases, not in all cases. But this is another reason to not just use drugs, to use nutrition as well. So enough so that I was involved in starting a company that sells these products, is I very strongly recommend nutrition, dietary supplementation. Off the medication, if the dietary supplements work by themselves, then that's great. If you don't need the medicine, don't use them. But especially if you take the medications, the dietary supplements are important, at least to counteract what the medication is doing, but also to treat the underlying disease. So here's a slide that I've shown to medical students over the years, like 20 years or so. It hasn't changed very much. Mitochondrial dysfunction. What kind of, though it can cause almost anything because everything requires energy in life, what are the common things? What do you really, what kind of things you say, aha, I should think energy metabolism? And here's many of them on here, and you can see that, that autism is on the top there. Neurodevelopmental disorders are pretty common. Um, Here's a little bit of just basic information. Mitochondria have two different genomes, or almost like two different species that our cells are made of. The mitochondria are like little symbiotes that live within our cells. They have their own DNA. They divide and make more mitochondria. There are 16,000 base pairs in the mitochondrial DNA inside the mitochondria, 37 genes. Maternal inheritance, because all the mitochondria come from the egg, not from the sperm. So a mitochondrial DNA is the same as your mother and your brothers and sisters, assuming they all have the same mother. And then there's the nuclear DNA, the chromosomes, so 23 pairs of chromosomes. There's 22,000 genes and 3 billion nucleotides there. There are about 1,000 of the genes that are encoded by the chromosomes, make proteins that go to the mitochondria. So out of the approximately 1,050 or so mitochondrial genes, only 37 of them are made by the mitochondrial DNA. The others are nuclear. But the mitochondrial DNA has a very high mutation rate, and it makes up for it. So in mitochondrial disorders, we're talking about a lot of nuclear, but also mitochondrial DNA. Nuclear DNA comes, of course, from both the mother and the father. And the inheritance patterns are the stuff that you're used to hearing about: autosomal recessive, dominant, X-linked, the usual inheritance patterns. Mitochondrial disease can be inherited on the mitochondrial DNA or the nuclear DNA, or in many cases on both. This is showing a very idealized pedigree. The grandmother in the upper right-hand corner, the circles are female, has a mitochondrial DNA sequence. Whether that sequence helps her or hurts her, she's going to pass it on to all of her children, whether they're boys or girls. Her girls are going to pass it on to all of their children, regardless who the father is, and her boys are not going to pass it on to any of them. So in reality, all of the people that have the red circles or squares all have the same mitochondrial DNA sequence, and everybody else has a different sequence. So everyone in the red should have the same disease, right? It's not the way biology works. This is a real pedigree from a family. And different diseases show up in different individuals because the mitochondrial DNA is a risk factor. Not having enough energy puts stress on cells in different situations. Will they cause disease? Well, it depends on the rest of the genetics and the environment. So you can see that the people in black all have the same mitochondrial DNA sequence. And the people in the black have a lot more disease manifestations than the people that don't have black symbols. But you can see that it predisposes towards many different disorders. Then I'm going to give another case report here. William was 10 years old when I made this slide. He had chronic pain, a myopathy, so he had like a muscular dystrophy-like thing, severe constipation. He was an excellent student. Biochemical testing showed that he had, and muscle biopsy showed that he had mitochondrial disease. And his pedigree looked like maternal inheritance, that other people with the same mitochondrial DNA also had a propensity for different disorders, particularly pain, fatigue, and bowel dysfunction. Sequencing found an abnormality in the mitochondrial DNA. 55%. 55% of the mitochondrial DNA had the mutation, 45% did not. The mother, who also had symptoms, had 78% of the mutation. She was not more affected because just because you find it in blood doesn't mean that other tissues are going to be the same. Other tissues are going to have other percentages. On the mitochondrial cocktail, he got significantly better. His headache, his muscle cramps, his abdominal pain went away. But I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about his little sister, Izzy. Izzy also presented when she was 6 years old because she had extremely severe anxiety. At age 5 years, she couldn't get her teeth clean, go to birthday parties. She couldn't participate in any extracurricular activities. Her mother had to be present at kindergarten with her. If she just left the room for a minute, Izzy would have a panic attack. This was very disruptive for her. She also had chronic right ankle pain, which had been there for years, and of course she got many MRIs and no one could figure out what was going on. She had 78% of the mutation for the same mutation. I put her on sertraline, which is Zoloft, which has mitochondrial effects, and a mitochondrial cocktail. Not only did her anxiety completely go away and she was able to participate in birthday parties, go to school without her mother and everything, but also her ankle pain went away. Chronic pain is often mitochondrial. So how do you treat mitochondrial dysfunction? Well, you can increase the energy supply. In other words, mitochondrial dysfunction is when the mitochondria are not working right. In mitochondria, one of the things they do is to make energy. Exercise makes more mitochondria, but many of the vitamins like coenzyme Q10, carnitine, creatine, riboflavin also will help the mitochondria because those vitamins are necessary for the mitochondria to function. Decreasing energy demand. If you have a brownout in the city and you don't have enough power plants working on a really hot day, you can get like mitochondrial dysfunction, energy dysfunction in the city. So you try to say, everyone, don't use your appliances in the afternoon and don't put up the air conditioning up to full blast. Decrease in energy demand can make a big difference because you can't make the mitochondria normal no matter how many vitamins you throw at it. Protecting mitochondrial against reactive oxygen species. This is perhaps the one that's the most important because abnormal mitochondria make reactive oxygen species. It's sort of the pollution of life. The more the mitochondria is not working right, the more ROS you make. It's like if a car is going up a hill, it may make some pollution, make it pull a trailer at freeway speeds, it's going to make a lot more pollution. It may not be able to do it. So when the mitochondria are under more stress, they're going to produce more pollution. And those reactive oxygen species, they're really nasty. They can break down DNA, membranes, proteins, etc. And protecting the body against those ROS is a major part of mitochondrial treatment. Also treating the symptoms involved. For neuropathic pain, you can use medications that work on that. For channelopathies, depression, GI, there's many things. So you treat the symptoms as well as treating the underlying cause. So putting this together as a holistic approach to ADHD. There's lifestyle. We said before that good, healthy living is good mitochondrial health. The diet, particularly fresh fruits and vegetables for natural antioxidants. Exercise, frequent and in moderation. Good sleep hygiene, going to bed about the same time every day. Light during the daytime, absence of a lot of blue light during night. Getting enough sleep. These things are really important. And avoiding toxins. A lot of the toxins work on the mitochondria. In particular, smoking and alcohol are mitochondrial toxins. They increase free radicals as well as other things. Supplements. You can make a big difference on top of diet because no matter how much you eat, no matter how well you eat, you can eat the entire salad bar, but it won't give you as much as what you can get in a supplement for certain specific nutrients. So high dosing of a highly bioavailable and activated forms. We've already mentioned things like medications in certain circumstances, stimulants for ADHD, SSRIs or SNRIs for anxiety and depression, and then counseling, particularly trying to make the best of the situation that you have, not sitting down on a couch and trying to figure out why you're going crazy, because this is not going crazy. What it is to say these are your limitations, and how are you going to live as full a life as possible with the limitations? What can we do to work out how you're going to get the right sleep and how you're going to take your medications and your vitamins and how you're going to try to reduce your stress levels because that makes your mitochondria and your brain go crazy. And of course, working with the school to try to get the appropriate testing and accommodations to allow the child to reach their full potential. So this is a holistic approach to put everything together. Okay, obviously this is a talk from a vitamin company and we're going to be talking about dietary supplementation. So what does the data show? I'm going to go through this really fast, but these slides will be available on the website. There are a couple of good studies that show that acetyl-carnitine is useful in ADHD. Magnesium is important. Magnesium, B6, and zinc are often tested together. They're particularly B6 and magnesium. All three of these have been found to be useful in ADHD in certain studies. Essential fatty acid. None of our products have essential fatty acids in it. You can't really mix oils with the powders. But there are 6 out of 8 studies showed that essential fatty acids are important, and I recommend to address that. And those are your omega-3s, your fish oil, krill oil. So as an overview, we spoke about antioxidant therapy because the mitochondria is a major component. Carnitine, magnesium, B6, zinc, essential fatty acids. Vitamin D is often deficient in ADHD. And then there's other nutrients that haven't been tested in ADHD, but have been tested in autism and other related disorders like CoQ, folate, and B12. Those are actually very important in autism, but they haven't been tested in ADHD and probably are important in ADHD as well. One nutrient, copper, which is absolutely essential, the levels are high in ADHD, so that's one on the opposite side. The data suggests that a comprehensive yet not extremely complicated approach to nutrition may be helpful. If you could address all of the things on the slide here, then you would have the perfect nutrition for ADHD. It's important to address everything because think about the assembly line. In the lower left, you have Ford Motor Company, and on the right, you have Hyundai. What if the guy on the left, the guy in the middle there on the assembly line, what if he takes his vitamins and makes cars twice as fast? You're not going to make twice as many cars. You're just going to get chaos. Same thing. Think about one of those machines got a zap of electricity and goes twice as fast. That's really not helping you. Doing the a la carte. Let's try magnesium first. Okay, let's try carnitine first. Not only does it not necessarily, it is probably not going to make more energy. It's likely to have a lot of side effects. The upper chain and the Krebs cycle, which are actually together. It's an assembly line. Electrons enter at one side and they leave at the other side. Energy metabolism is an assembly line. And I find I get, not only do I get more positive effects, but I get less side effects when I use a cocktail that has a lot of things in it than if I go one at a time. Dr. Jim Adams thought the same thing. He took a powder that has 30-something active ingredients and tried it in autism. You can see that things like receptive language and improve, but also like tantruming and hyperactivity, which are very much ADHD type things, also improved. Bonnie Kaplan was using it mostly for adults with anxiety and depression, but she did do a case. She published 2 case studies of children that had explosive rage and found that her vitamin and mineral cocktail, which is similar to the Adams formula, helped with that. She's also did a lot of work to show that a vitamin and mineral cocktail is also highly tolerable. It's safe, and people have extremely few side effects. Dr. Adams did the same thing, finding no increased side effects over placebo. And I've seen that, in, like I said, in my patients, that vitamin cocktails are actually very heavily, they're well tolerated. So with a bunch of other people, only about half of them show up on the slide. The others we've added more recently. The idea was to come together and to make products that are easy to use, that include all of the things that are necessary at the doses that are important, using good manufacturing processes in the United States to make premium products that actually really work. And the first one we came up with is Spectrum Needs. It includes 20 ingredients of the mitochondrial cocktail, and the additional nutrients, the other 13, make it a full multivitamin and mineral, so you don't have to add another multivitamin on top of it. 2 different flavors. There's berry and lemon, and when we could go to conferences, we did taste tests and showed that it actually tastes really quite good. Most kids like it. And that all of the components that are important for ADHD that I've discussed in the previous slides are in this, except for there's not enough CoQ, and I'll get to that later, and the fish oil, the omega-3s. You got to add that separately because oil and powders don't mix. And the CoQs and the fish oil are oils. This is a product that we added in November. This is the one my son is on right now. It's pretty much the same as Spectrum Needs, but in a capsule form. But we use some higher levels of things like carnitine, riboflavin, and vitamin D that can cause some trouble in small babies. that I want to be able to handle the powder. So it's very similar to Spectrum Needs, but it has a little bit higher doses of some of the energy things. It's meant for older children, adolescents, and adults. And also put a bunch of immune boosters in because, of course, we developed this during the COVID era and put things like quercetin and rutin in it, as well as beta carotene and some other vitamin A in it to try to boost the immune system as much as possible. CoQ, I can't say enough about CoQ. It's probably the most important single nutrient. CoQ comes in ubiquinone and ubiquinol. So the ONE is the common form. You can see here ubiquinol versus ubiquinone towards the bottom there, but that is not very bioavailable. In fact, the OL form is 5 times more bioavailable, meaning you need 5 times more ubiquinone to get the same blood level. And ubiquinol is by far the most effective form of coenzyme Q10. It is an oil, and you really can't mix it in powders, and I recommend taking it separately. You can find liquid preparations and gel capsules on the internet. Some are in soy oil, and some of them are in limonene. The vast majority are in soy. Not everyone can take soy, and they have a variety of different prices. The really good ones were in limonene. They have very high bioavailability, ubiquinones in limonene, but they were incredibly expensive. So we market, you can see the little gel capsules there next to the penny. Q Needs is ubiquinol in limonene oil, which is which is oil taken from lemon peels. So it has no soy. It's more bioavailable than most of the products out there, and so you need less of it. And we offer it at a far less price than the competitors are offering similar. If you have a child that cannot take capsules, you can cut the ends off with scissors and squirt it into something and to flavor it. And there's one competitor I'm aware of that has a reasonable taste liquid preparation for CoQ. It is on the expensive side, but it is the best one on the market for liquid. Okay, switching gears a little bit, I've been talking about mitochondria. Now I'm going to talk about the synapse. The synapse is where the neurons meet. On the left-hand side, you have 2 neurons. Where they meet is blown up on the right. So the electric impulse of one neuron goes to the end of the neuron, causes neurotransmitters to be released into the synapse. Neurotransmitters bind to a receptor on the other neuron, and then causes that neuron to fire or not to fire, depending if it's an excitatory or an inhibitory neurotransmitter. This is a very simplified diagram, of course. Each nerve cell in the brain can have as many as 100,000 synapses to other neurons. So a neuron is either going to fire or it's not going to fire. But there can be 100,000 neurons, some telling it to fire, some telling it not to fire. And the neuron's either going to fire or not fire. The balance between excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmission is very important in neurological disease. GABA is a key inhibitory neurotransmitter, and GABA interneuron. Interneurons are little teeny neurons that connect other neurons in the brain. GABA interneurons are very, very sensitive to mitochondrial dysfunction. So this really is not separate from the mitochondria I've been talking about previously. The reason for that is, think of a toddler and a cookie jar. Cookie jar is on the refrigerator. Toddler says, I want a cookie, I want a cookie, I want a cookie. And you keep saying, nope, nope, nope. What if you say yes once? That cookie jar is gone. The same thing with the neurons. The inhibitory neurons have to keep saying, nope, don't fire, don't fire, don't fire. They're constantly sending signals of the neuron not to fire. If they stop sending signals, that neuron's going to fire. Excitatory neurons, they wait. They wait until they get the message. Okay, I've got the message, now fire. The inhibitory neurons, the inhibitory neurotransmitters are on all the time. They run out of energy fast. So you'd think, well, shouldn't it be the large neurons? No, it's the small little inner neurons that are on all the time that slow down the brain are the ones that you see with mitochondrial dysfunction, are the first ones to go. So you see overexcitation. Because I hear all the time from parents, how can it be a mitochondrial disorder when Johnny is running all over the place and has too much energy? Well, it's the inhibitory neurotransmitters that aren't working as well. You can buy things like GABA, L-theanine, 5-hydroxytryptophan, also known as 5-HTP, B6, and magnesium over the counter. And until we made ComNeeds, I was often telling my families to go buy all of that. Just like before I made Energy Needs or Spectrum Needs for 25 years, 30 years now, I've been telling people to get them over the counter separately. ComNeeds puts all of this together to try to improve GABA, but also to improve serotonin, which is also a major inhibitory neurotransmitter for the large part. A lot of my patients use this. They can take it in the morning for anxiety. Some of them will take it before, like they'll do public speaking or before class. Others will take it at night to try to remove the anxiety a little bit and allow them to sleep. This is not like a barbiturate or a benzodiazepine. It is not a tranquilizer. This is not a sedative. It does not make you tired. It just reduces the amount of excitatory to inhibitory balance, kind of mellows you out a little bit. But they're safe and over the counter, everything here. So, okay, putting it all together. What do I recommend in autism and ADHD? Well, a comprehensive micronutritional product that puts many different things together. Spectrum Needs and powder, Energy Needs in capsules is, I think, a really good choice. And I do suggest you check blood levels for carnitine and for 25-hydroxy vitamin D, because they may need to be supplemented separately in some people to get enough of it. The ubiquinol form of CoQ. Anyone over about 40 pounds, I usually start at 20 milligrams twice a day. With Q needs, if you use some of the competitor brands, you may need 300, 400, or even more twice daily. For some brands, you need over 1,000 to get levels twice daily or 3 times daily. And to check blood levels, I like the CoQ levels to be quite high. I find that people do better when their levels are much higher than normal, the 4 to 7 range. Normal is about 0.6 to 1.4. Essential fatty acid supplement. There are many brands for this. We don't make one of those. And then if there's anxiety, hyperactivity, or insomnia, to consider a GABA, theanine, and 5-HTP combination product. Adding on top of that, lifestyle. Diet, exercise, sleep, and avoidance of toxins are important. If you're smoking and using alcohol, deal with that. If not getting the correct sleep, deal with that. Vitamins are really important, but they're not going to make up for somebody who has a toxic lifestyle. Except in mild cases, dietary supplementation should not be considered to replace appropriate medication, but as an addition to appropriate medication. And maybe to mitigate some of those side effects of medication as well. But this is not to say that you can treat all of ADHD with vitamins alone. That's not necessarily true, but I do think in the majority of cases that you can make a difference. And then, of course, these are general recommendations. They're not meant to go against your physician's advice or to be used in lieu of your physician's advice. All treatments, even just vitamins, like what we're talking about here, are all over-the-counter products that are in foods. It doesn't matter. Anything that you do for your health, you should discuss with your physician. It's just good general advice. And if you're interested in getting more information, if you're interested in our products, neuroneeds.com. And then if you're interested in neurogenomics program, there's there's the website there. And that's it. And I think now it's time for questions. Okay, here I see the questions. Is there a link between chromium and ADHD? There is a link between chromium and a lot of neurological problems, and there is a link between chromium and glucose metabolism, sugar metabolism. I'm not aware of one with chromium and ADHD. There is chromium in both spectrum needs and in energy needs. Let's see. Rare genes. I really can't comment on individual genes, but there are the Grias and the Greeks are genes that are involved in glutamate metabolism. Glutamate metabolism is, or glutamate, actually they are receptors. Glutamate is the number one excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. So with glutamate disorders, and I see them a lot in patients with ADHD, the calm needs can often be helpful, but also the other products can as well in some cases. Why beta carotene? Beta carotene is a safe form of vitamin A. You can't live without vitamin A, but too much vitamin A can cause birth defects and a lot of health problems. Beta carotene is two vitamin A's together, and it's a safe form of vitamin A. It's an excellent antioxidant, which is why we put it into energy needs. Someone said they have found GABA to be helpful in tics and Tourette's. Well, tics, there are many different things that can be due in part to an imbalance between the excitation and inhibition at the synapse. Hyperactivity, obviously, but migraine, seizures, anxiety, there's a lot of them. And tics are another hyper excitable state of the nervous system. So there are people that can get benefit from GABA, as well as other products such as L-theanine, which can help GABA metabolism. Other than genetic testing, what tests do you recommend? The old-fashioned way was to do metabolic testing and chromosomal testing, and then if you found something to do genetic testing when possible to confirm it. For about 10 years now, I've been going the other direction. Particularly the last 5 years, I do genetic testing in everybody, and I'll occasionally use the other test to confirm it. Genetic testing is a lot cheaper than just doing 1,000 different tests, and it gives you a lot more information. The other test that I order on a routine basis is I like to get levels in the blood of coenzyme Q10, 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and carnitine-free, FREE, and total, to make sure that I'm giving enough. Because some people need huge amounts of vitamin D, others they only need a little. Some people need much more carnitine or CoQ. Very frequently we're giving additional vitamin D. And like I said, CoQ is extra. And once in a while, we need to give more carnitine. I also do a lot of mitoswab. It's MITOSWAB, all one word. That looks at, we used to do muscle biopsy, cost $10,000, required surgery and anesthesia. And now we do mitoswab, which is like $300, and you can do it from saliva. And it tells me what parts of, first of all, if the mitochondria is not really working and what parts of the mitochondria are not working. I use that in addition to genetic sequencing, because many times we'll say, okay, the problem is, let's say, in a channel or a neurotransmitter, but the mitochondrial dysfunction is real and important. And it is showing that there's mitochondrial dysfunction on a laboratory test justifies the use of the mitochondrial cocktail and helps other doctors realize that there really is a mitochondrial dysfunction. Other testing I don't really do on a routine basis. I mean, it'll be on an individual basis if I see something in the DNA or if there's some particular abnormality. Obviously that things like electrolyte testing, particularly looking at potassium levels, acid levels in the blood, sodium levels, CBC, thyroid testing. I mean, there's some kind of general testing that's often done as well. But I really, except for the fact that I do genetic testing in a large number of my patients, there isn't any other test that I really do in everybody. Let's see, some of these questions on here are really like specific genes that I really shouldn't get involved in. Is developmental delay always an indication of a mental disorder? Developmental delay means just developmental delay. Unfortunately, in many cases, they never catch up, and then you get intellectual disability. But sometimes you do catch up with a lot of kids with developmental delay become completely normal adults or older children. And well, mental disorder. What's a mental disorder? I mean, these are all involved in the brain. Development, anxiety, depression, they're all different parts of the brain. So I don't like drawing a line around and saying what's a mental disorder. This is all just brain health. And okay, we are just over an hour now, so I'm going to stop. So thank you very much if you got to this point.